I haven't had time. I actually did logic, like with my friend, and now I'm going to Hegel's logic. So it's
yeah, no problem. All right, can you guys hear me?
yeah.
All right. So last time we were doing existence to quality, and I figured something out in the meantime, which changes things, but I think it's probably not a good idea to go over it right now. Suffice to say, I don't know. Did I go over last time? Did I mention the whole thing about reflective and immanent dialectics?
Not really. A little.
Because I mean, the thing I came to discover was something about how that functions within and between chapter 1 and chapter 2, and also how it's working within chapter 2 as we're going. I guess I'll just make a mention of that. So, if you remember, Hegel tells us at points that that when he's saying something, sometimes he's saying it merely as a reflection, as something external which we can notice about it, but which we don't have like logical warrant to say from within. So it's the external considerations, stuff like nothing is an external consideration. It's a reflection. Nothing itself does not speak this truth. Stuff about how becoming is ceasing to be and coming to be, for example. That's an external reflection still, because it's using determinacy to speak about becoming, even though we actually were beginning with this indeterminacy. So in becoming, we've already we've already leaped into determinate being, despite the fact that we don't actually intend to, but we don't have warrant to say it at that point, which is kind of funny. And likewise, determinate being or existence in this translation begins with a sort of reflective as well as an immanent form. So, going over how that works out, Hegel says at the beginning that determinacy is being with a non-being taken up into it. On the immanent side, as far as to finish saying the stuff on immanent and external and reflective dialectics, reflective dialectics have to do with just that, stuff like being is nothing, nothing is being. On the being side, immanently we get nothing. On the nothing side, we only get back to being by doing an external reflection on it. Even though it's not legitimate, I think, because you're not using anything new. You already had being, so it's legitimate to go ahead and reflect upon nothing and see its form as being. So, it's not like, oh, well, you just brought something like completely, utterly out of the ballpark, and, in order to force it, not quite. But it's not where Hegel really wants to aim at. Hegel doesn't want to just keep things as a reflective dialectic form. He wants to get into a full immanence, which will, from within itself, fully play out exactly the whole thing. So up to now, in existence, up to quality, we haven't gotten that. We've been relying on these external reflections in order to get us to move, and it's not actually because we couldn't move without them. I think it's more so the fact that if he didn't do this, a lot of us would be like incapable of grasping what he's actually saying, because the immanent turn is something that is so radically different from the way we think that we need ways to ease us into seeing this immanence.
Well, is this something mentioned in the subjugation? Or maybe I'm wrong.
No, that's just, it's not, he doesn't mention it, actually. He does mention stuff, you know, he'll tell us, oh, by the way, this is a reflection. He doesn't tell us, yeah.
I don't mean like explicitly, but you mean by like immanent that that thing is already present in that first concept, and we don't need like other external concepts to get to that other stage.
Yeah. From immanence, it's, if you think through it, you'll get to the other side. Whereas you notice if you think about nothing, for example, you know, you don't get to nothing is from within nothing. You just stay at nothing.
Yep.
You need to make an external stepping back to see the form of nothing and say, ah, it's being. And that gets you back to being. But from within, nothing doesn't go back to being.
Yeah.
Not at this stage of abstraction. Eventually, it does actually go back in the logic of essence. It's also the fact that reflections are subjective, and Hegel tells us that much. He says, you know, these are external reflections, and you know they're relying on our own subjective foreknowledge of things that we can't really explain at this point. So, for example, the distinction between being and nothing, the fact that we intend them to be different, that's an external reflection of the subject. You know, we know there is indeed a difference between being and nothing. At the beginning, however, we are incapable of speaking this difference. We're incapable of thinking it, because the differences we want to say aren't things that we have built up yet. And yet, nonetheless, you know, we can rely on that. It's not yet legitimate, so it is an illegitimate thing. But nonetheless, the way we're using it is not illegitimate. You know, it will end up being the fact that being and nothing are one and the same, and they are really different, and there is such a thing as being in itself and nothing in itself. But, you know, they'll always keep this immanent link between each other, just like how in becoming, you know, being is nothing and nothing is being by virtue of their vanishing, that they immediately are each other. But this is only an immediacy. You know, once we get to mediations, we suddenly have like this seemingly separate moment of being and nothing, but not really. You know, in order to have the separate moment, you know, nothing would have to be, and you know, being would have to be the nothing of the nothing, and you know, that kind of stuff. All right, so that's all I wanted to say. Perhaps keep that in mind. Don't think about it too much. I'll try to mention it when I notice it, but believe me, I'm amazed it took this long for me to figure it out, because once you figure it out, you're like, wow, that's so obvious. But initially, you know, it takes effort to see this difference.
Okay, guys, before we start, can I just get 10 seconds? I just need to grab the ashtray downstairs.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
Hey there, welcome, Stoa.
Hello.
Hey, Sto. What's going on?
Nothing much. I didn't get to participate much in last week's reading, unfortunately.
Hopefully you listened to it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's up on his YouTube page.
Yeah, I linked it here and did the everyone, so if you missed it, I don't know.
Yeah. I always try to make time to check them out afterward.
Yeah, we'll do a quick review. Things are going to get weird today, and you'll see this whole problem of immanence. And as a matter of fact, this should allow me to shed some light back into the stuff I figured out on Chapter 1.
Oh, great.
Which is something else to mention. Every time you get a new concept, always reflect on that concept back onto the stuff that we've already done, and you'll realize it actually reveals things about the prior stuff, which is amazing. You know, it's one of the things that's so great about Hegel. Every single thing you come up with literally changes everything before it as well.
Oh yeah. I heard one of the interpreters, I don't recall who, mentioned that for that reason one should read many of his works twice, because after you've picked up on many of the concepts explained throughout them, you can glean a new meaning from the second one.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Alright, so going back over existence in general, you know, page 83 in the PDF, which is A, existence as such, section 2197. In existence as such, to do its determinants is first to be distinguished as quality. The latter, however, is to be taken in both the two determinations of existence as reality and negation. In these determinacies, however, existence is equally reflected into itself, and as so reflected, is posited as, see, something, and existent. So, A, existence in general. Existence proceeds from becoming. It actually doesn't, by the way. Existence is just the frozen image of becoming. But, you know, it's just one interesting thing. If you have a diagram of becoming, and you look at it, what it looks like is exactly what existence is.
Yeah.
Which is, I guess I should point that out. If you haven't looked at my thing on my blog on dialectics, perhaps you should. But there's a point in which I talk about speculation, which is the moment of thinking about thinking, which is sometimes you hit a wall and you just keep going in circles, like becoming. You know, if you keep trying to think ceasing to be and coming to be, you're just going in an endless circle. There's nowhere to go from within. But if you step back and you just look at that entire movement as a whole, that itself is the movement you need to realize that you've gone somewhere else. So if you're stuck within becoming and you're just going circles and circles and circles, and you stand back, you say, oh, ceasing to be and coming to be. You know, if you look at becoming as if it were a frozen totality, what do you see? Well, you see exactly what existence actually is. You see being with nothing in immediate unity, side by side. And if you take into account the entire movement and you see all the possible combinations, you see, being is nothing both on its own side, and then nothing is being also on its own side. And you can see this as either two separate things, you could see it as one single thing, and it doesn't matter which way you see it, the conclusion is the same, and the understanding is more or less correct, but one of them is more correct than the other. Because if you look at it as if it were a still image with being and nothing right next to each other, you know, as coming to be and ceasing to be frozen, you've already jumped too far. You've already gone to something another. And so it's a bit of an illegitimate form because it's too reflective. If you looked at it from the immanence, you would actually just see a superimposition of being on top of nothing at the same time. You wouldn't see them as these separate circles side by side or separate constants side by side. You'd actually just see like a whole blob of being nothing as one thing. And the imminent way to get out of that is to actually literally think the being of nothing. But so that is one of the interesting things that one can glean from diagramming. So anyways, continuing, it is a simple oneness of being and nothing. On account of this simplicity, it has the form of an immediate. That is, you know, there's nothing separating it. It really is nothing and being at the exact same time, exact same thing, exact same place. Its mediation, the becoming, lies behind it. That is, the becoming is something that you never really see. It's something that happens, but you can never see it happening. Every time you think that you're going to stop and say, I'm going to look at becoming, you lose it. You know, you just fall back right into being and nothing. So one of the interesting things, becoming itself never appears even though it's there everywhere and happening all the time. So the becoming lies behind it, has sublated itself, and existence therefore appears as a first from which the forward move is made. It is at first in the one-sided determination of being. The other determination, which it contains nothing, will likewise come up in it in contrast to the first. And so why is this in the one-sided determination of being? Well, you can't help it. The moment you step back and you see, it's being and nothing are one and the same thing, you can't help but state this as the being of this unity. Even if you don't want to say it, you must think it this way. But in doing that stepping back and seeing the unity as itself being, it is not mere being, but existence. Or Dasein in German. And to make a point here, it's kind of funny because this whole reflexive thing happens everywhere in Hegel, and if you manage to notice it, it's just it's a mind bender. What is existence in the end? Well, it's the being of being. Quite literally. If you look at this still image of becoming, becoming itself is being, because being is its vanishing to nothing. So when you have that whole movement completed and frozen before you as a whole, what do you have? That being is being, vanishing to nothing. But the vanishing has always already happened. It's already been being and nothing. So being is always already being and nothing. The being of being is existence. Just like how the becoming of becoming is existence. It's just this really curious, self-reflexive relation. And actually it makes perfect sense, by the way. In order to say that being is, what have you done? You said being is being. Being is being. You have two beings right next to each other. You had to take being out of itself in order to even be able to conceive being as itself. Does that make sense? I actually have a couple of diagrams I should upload. I'll post them right now in the chat. Okay, so I just posted 3 images, and I'm just going to go over it real quickly just to show you how this works and why I say that it doesn't matter which way you look at it, you end up the same way. So in the first diagram I just posted, you see the totality becoming and then being nothing fully fleshed out as, ceasing to be and coming to be, and explicitly as both at the same time on each side. This is what when we first get to a determinate being, it intuitively looks like, because it's what we immediately go for. We normally can only think about this in oppositional terms of, when Hegel says, being and nothing are in immediate unity, we seem to think literally that being is on one side and nothing is on another side. But obviously when we think it out, being, which is ceasing to be, is always already coming to be, and nothing is already ceasing to be as well. And these are as a whole are becoming. And so we've already thought about this as a unity of two things which are the same kind of thing, but which oppose each other. that is too reflective at this point, even though it's what we already do, and Hegel recognizes that it's what we already do. But this already jumps too far into something and other. So the second diagram shows just becoming as the simple unity of being and nothing, in which we don't even consider them, we only consider them as like one perspective of each other, you know, from the perspective of one, in which we only consider being as the ceasing to be and nothing as coming to be, and becoming as this existence, determinate being. That's still too much, because we still are thinking being and nothing as if they were separate. And in the last one, in which I try to just visually superimpose nothing and being, or being and nothing, that's how you should really take it. That in fact we don't actually have a true separation of a concept of being and nothing. When Hegel says being is nothing, that really is it. Being really is this self-negating activity. So the actual immanent move, as opposed to the reflective move, is the self-negation of being into being. The being of being is necessarily a negativity against itself. Does that make sense? And so that's interesting, because see, I mean, someone says on the metaphor of human life goes from becoming, birth, to nothing, death. In that sense, it contains both moments. When I read Heidegger, I read Heidegger, I understood Heidegger's Dasein as human being. Yes, but you're still thinking about it too reflectively split. The fact is that to live is to die. Life only exists as this constant dying and regeneration. Like, life really is a contradiction, you know. Life is the world literally consuming itself, which is weird. But it really makes sense that way. So it's not that, you know, life is here and then birth is there. You know, birth is here as life, and then death is there as, you know, the nothing. It always already began dead. It already began dying. So there's just a whole slew of fun little things you can always do to see this unity of being and nothing, and existence and becoming. And frankly, the more you notice it, God, the way stranger it seems, and yet the more and more it makes sense. So anyways, you move on. Sorry, I don't want to keep on this too long. I want to actually make it advance today. So as it falls upon becoming, page 84, existence is in general being with a non-being. So that this non-being is taken up into simple unity with being. Non-being thus taken up into being, with the result that the concrete whole is in the form of being, of immediacy, constitutes determinateness as such. So just one last reflection on this whole being is nothing thing. I think I mentioned this before, like when we first read the chapter. Always keep in mind this strange unity and yet distinction between thought and thinking, between being and the being of being. You know, staticness and activity, dynamicity. That to be static is already a dynamism. That to be is already to be a negating, you know, of itself, which is this will be most apparent when we start talking about something and other, because the other is where this just fully explodes for the first time, like in the open. But, you know, this being with a non-being, you know, this thought as a thinking, you know, that's a good way to put it, you know, either as being or thought as thinking. You know, the unity of being and its being, its activity, is determinateness. You know, it's like we don't have to think about this in the first image where we're thinking of oppositional terms of something other already. We can literally just think about this as the negativity of being. In the way we're going to cash this out is obviously, well, in order for negativity to be there, there's going to have to be another. So that's determinateness. B quality, bottom of 84. Top of 85. Determinateness has yet to detach itself from being, nor will it ever detach itself from being. Since the now underlying truth is the unity of non-being with being, all further determinations will transpire on this basis. But the connection with determinateness now has with being is one of the immediate unity of the two, so that as yet no differentiation between the two is posited. You know, see, being is its negativity. It is, we can't yet say, you know, being is here and nothing is there, and thus being is the negation of nothing, or nothing is the negation of being. Determinacy is, in fact, just this negativity of being itself. You know, this very falling or vanishing of being into nothing. You know, this becoming of being. Determinateness, thus isolated by itself as existent determinateness, is quality. So notice how we get that. We have determinateness. What can we do? Well, just like how in becoming, the way we got out of it is, well, we got nowhere else to go. Apply becoming to itself. Just that same way we get from determinacy to determinate determinateness. Because why not? We can do it. There is no logical rule that stops us at this moment from doing it. Now, one of the things that constantly you have to keep in mind in the logic is, if it's possible to think it, then you can do it. There's no reason not to. If you can self-apply a concept, why not? And it makes perfect sense. If being is its own negativity, upon what must its negativity apply? There's nothing else to apply except to itself. You know, the determinateness of determinateness, the being of being. So, exists determinateness, or determinateness, shorthand, quality. Something totally simple, immediate. Determinateness in general is the more universal, which, further determined, can be something quantitative as well. On account of this simplicity, there is nothing further to say about quality as such. Existence, however, in which nothing and being are equally contained, is itself the measure of the one-sidedness of quality as an only immediate or existent determinateness. So, you know, we've got the determinateness of determinateness. But in having determined this determinateness, there's a third determinateness, obviously. You know, as we were talked about last time. I don't know if you were here for that, Ivan, which you always have to keep in mind this: that being, that existence is being with a non-being. So it's self-negation is always implied. So whenever we have this sudden affirmation which we make, we immediately have to also consider, oh, there's a self-negation coming along with it. Just makes sense. So from existence as existent to determinateness, which is quality, quality is equally to be posited in the determination of nothing, and the result is that the immediate or existent determinateness is posited as distinct, reflected in the nothing, as thus the determinate element of determinateness will equally be something reflected, a negation. Quality in the distinct value of existent is reality. When affected by a negating, it is a negation in general, still a quality, but one that counts as a lack and is further determined as limit, restriction. So the whole thing about limit, that's jumping forward, but that's going to come up. So the way we get to reality and negation is, well, reality is the name of the being of quality, and negation is the name of the non-being of quality. Why? Because determinateness is the self-negation of itself, and in order to self-negate, something must be generated out of that self-negation. Makes sense? As someone says, negation is non-being of quality, that is itself a quality, and quality is existent determinateness, and reality is existent quality. Yep. And also, I mean, why would you pause, just to elaborate, you know, the reason obviously that one would posit that obviously negation must then be an affirmation is literally chapter 1 tells us as much. Being is nothing. If there's nothing, if there's a negation, there must be a being right there as well. So then we have the remark, and all the remark does is just simply to talk about some historical considerations of how other people thought about the term reality and quality, and how there was a mistake in keeping reality and negation separate, in which reality was purely positive and people thought that you can have an affirmation without negation, which Hegel, obviously, if we accept the logic so far, that just cannot be the case. It cannot be intelligible. Alright, so that was recap. Now on to something. In existence, its determinateness has been distinguished as quality. In this quality, as something existing, the distinction exists. The distinction of reality and negation. Now, though these distinctions are present in existence, they are just as much null and sublated. Reality itself contains negation. It is existence, not indeterminate or abstract being. Negation is, for its part, equally existence, not the supposed abstract nothing, but posit here as it is in itself as existent, as belonging to existence. Thus quality is in general unseparated from existence, and the latter is only determinate, qualitative being. So obviously, if you have a reality, the positive form of a quality, it nonetheless, the fact that it is an existent means it has a negativity within it. You know, it's a being with a non-being. And if you have a non-being, a negation, since we already know that negations, nothing is being as well, then obviously it must also have a reality of its own. And here we get, obviously, the next opposition, you know. He says that the distinction exists. Qualitative being, you know, the full determinacy of of determinateness is what we might call the reapplication of what we've developed. So we have developed determinateness, we've determined it as quality. We can then go ahead and say, well, okay, let's reapply that right back to being. The determinacy of being. Qualitative being thus implies a being which has a reality and a negation. But if there is a negation, then something else must be there in order to effect that negation. So now we have the seeming positing of two beings in determinate being. Clear so far? Your English is not terrible. I have heard much worse from people who have utterly no shame. Yeah, seriously, there are native speakers who are just, you wonder where they learned their language from. Alright, so continuing, this sublation of the distinction is more than the mere retraction and external re-omission of it, or a simple return to the simple beginning, to existence as such. The distinction cannot be left out, for it is. Therefore, what de facto is at hand is this: existence in general, distinction in it, and the sublation of this distinction, the existence, not void of distinctions, as at the beginning, but as again self-equal to the sublation of the distinction, the simplicity of existence mediated through this sublation. The state of sublation of the distinction is existence' own determinateness. Existence is thus being in itself. It is existent something. Okay, so that was a bit of a mouthful, and I know that the first time I read that, I was just like, what in the hell did he just say? So, I mean, recall that last time I made a bit of a point on the whole fact that it seems to be weird that we have determinacy and then we have the determinacy of determinacy. And when he talks about this distinction, this is what I think he means. He's talking about this distinction between being as such and the determinacy of being, indeterminate being. That somehow we make this distinction. But the return of this distinction and realizing, it's the determinacy of being, does not erase the distinction. So when he says existence in general, determinateness, distinction in it, the determinateness of determinateness, and the sublation of this distinction, which is, let's phrase it this way, the determinate being of determinate being. If determinate being is qualitative being, then obviously that should make sense. Qualitative being is the determinate being of determinate being, or the existence of existence. You see how that reappropriation of what it seems to be like this external difference is made? Because it really isn't. It really isn't external. It is a distinction, but you have to notice that we made the distinction from within. We have determinate being, and then we have to determine this determinacy. But this determinacy isn't outside. This determinacy is the determinacy of determinate being. So, when he says the sublation of the distinction is more than the mere retraction and external re-omission of it, or a simple return to the simple beginning, to existence as such, we've gone into it, determined it from within, and we've gone step back once again and seen the whole thing. Determinate being is qualitative being, but qualitative being cannot be reduced to mere determinacy. That's why he says, it's not a simple return to the simple beginning. So the existence not void of distinctions as at the beginning, but as again self-equal through the sublation of the distinction, the simplicity of existence mediated through the sublation. The state of sublation of the distinction is existence's own determinateness. Existence is thus being in itself. It is existent, something. That's interesting. I missed that the first reading. The state of sublation of the distinction is existence's own determinateness. Existence is thus being in itself. It is existent, something. So I'll kind of spoil this because I think it's important and it just saves you some trouble. We're actually not starting this on something. Something is just a false thing. It's just a made-up name we're using right now. It's actually not a real concept that we're going to be making use of. Like, the real concept is going to come out of being in itself. And how is it the being in itself? Well, the determinate being of determinate being was found out what? Not from outside, but from the very determinacy of its determinacy. We have determinate being within determinate being. Isn't that strange? All clear? Alright, so hopefully you're writing diagrams or some notes, because things are gonna start reflecting really hard, really fast. So better keep track of all these movements that are going to start happening. Continuing. Something is the first negation of negation, as simple existent self-reference. I'm just gonna say, make of that what you will, because almost every way that you can think about it, you're right. And the only issue would be, how many ways you haven't thought about it, which are also right. Partly, I think one can think about this. This is the first negation of negation, as in God, kind of the way that the being of being, is a negation of being, and thus you have this sort of being arising from being, which is weird. And then once we have determined that, how did we do it? Well, by also negating the second being that we got out of being in order to finally get the real determinacy of determinate being. It's also the negation of negation, in which something is a negation of an other, an external other, and a whole slew of other things. You can have fun just coming up with all these other different negations of negations. It's also that something here is meant as the affirmative of a negation against an other. It's the positive quality, the reality, as opposed to the negation. Continuing, existence, life, thought, and so forth essentially take on the determination of an existent being, a living thing, a thinking mind, I, and so forth. So that's interesting. Notice the metaphors he makes right there. Existence, life, thought, and so forth take on the determination of an existent being, a living thing, and a thinking mind. So existence is here literally from within the very existing of things. Life is the very living of things, and thought is the very thinking of things. So, dynamism is already filled by, well, it's already filling what normally you would think as static. So that's a pretty important thing. Existence already carries this activity within it. Yeah, it's a nice concrete example. So this determination is of the highest importance if we do not wish to halt at existence, life, thought, and so forth as generalities, also not at godhood instead of God. In common representation, something rightly carries the connotation of a real thing, yet it is still a very superficial determination, just as reality and negation, existence and its determinateness, though no longer the empty being and nothing, still are quite abstract determinations. For this reason, they also are the most common expressions, and a reflection that is still philosophically unschooled uses them the most. It casts its distinctions in them, fancying that in them it has something really well and firmly determined. As something, the negative of the negative is only the beginning of the subject. Its in-itselfness is still quite indeterminate. It determines itself further on, at first as existent for itself, and so on, until it finally obtains in the concept the intensity of the subject. So, if we were to just stop and say, this is what something is, we fail to really consider what we have before us. We've forgotten the actual dynamism that led to this. But, if we pay attention to this dynamism from within, we realize that's not really a stopping point. No, something really isn't saying much of anything at all. At the base of all these determinations, there lies negative unity with itself. In all this, however, care must be taken to distinguish the first negation as negation in general, from the second negation, the negation of negation which is concrete, absolute negativity, just as the first is on the contrary only abstract negativity. So, that's interesting. At the base of all these determinations, there lies the negative unity with itself. It brings us back what I said earlier. The being of being is the negative unity of being with itself. Determinate being is the negative unity of being with itself, etc., etc. And if you diagram that out, you really think about it, perfect sense. A lot of thinking is contained in this concept. Oh yeah, this existence is where it really does explode. Once it's where you really see how determination arises out of itself. That last bit, in all this, however, care must be taken to distinguish the first negation as negation in general, from the second negation, the negation of negation, which is concrete, absolute negativity, just as the first is, on the contrary, only abstract negativity. So I think that's relating to what he says up on top, a little bit further up. As something, the negative of the negative is only the beginning of the subject. Its in itselfness is still quite indeterminate. It's a sort of negation in general. Which is, well, it is this simply because it is not anything else. It's not that, or whatever. And that's the first sense of negation. That's what negation kind of implies, when we talk about the negation in reality and quality. The second negation, the negation of negation, which is concrete, absolute negativity, just as the first is, on the contrary, on only abstract negativity. And the negation of negation is obviously absolute negativity, and the reason is quite cheeky, and it's literally very literal. It's negativity negating itself. The being of being. So, at the end of the logic, we'll get a full account of how in the hell it is possible that the being of being is fully contained within being and needs nothing else but itself. How negativity is fully contained within itself, and at the same time it's being. An absolute negativity is nothing but an absolute being. Pretty nifty, huh?
Yeah, so sorry, I'm taking notes.
Yeah, no problem. This is pretty heady stuff, and boy, it's dense.
Yeah,
I'm telling you, the first time I read this stuff just flew over my head.
Well, you need to understand the processes that are happening the first time, and then it's sort of repeating. But yeah, it's quite hard.
Yeah, it takes a lot of working through. By the way, is the noise in the background very audible? Or no?
Not that much, but yeah, I heard that old modem connecting to internet sound. I had quite a giggle.
Ah, that's weird. So I guess CNN sounds like an old modem. It sure works like one. Alright, sorry, I was moving. Continuing. Something is an existent as a negation of negation, for such a negation is the restoration of the simple reference to itself. But the something is thereby equally the mediation of itself with itself. So notice that. So as the negation of negation, something, if we take it as a concept, is the restoration of the simple reference to itself, but the something is thereby equally the mediation of itself with itself. You know, it's the negation of... It posits itself as a negation of all otherness. But we haven't quite played that out yet. You know, if you notice that we only have qualitative being, but the implication of qualitative being is that there is something else. So something cannot be just this full affirmation that we want to take it to be. You know, we're missing something. Present in the simplicity of something, and then with a greater determinateness in being for itself, in the subject, and so forth, this mediation of itself with itself is also already present in becoming, but only as totally abstract mediation. A mediation with itself is... sorry about that. Mediation with itself is posited in the something insofar as the latter is determined as a simple identity. Attention can be drawn to the presence of mediation in general, as against the principle of the alleged bare immediacy of a knowledge from which mediation should be excluded. But there is no further need to draw particular attention to the moment of mediation, since it is to be found everywhere and on all sides in every concept. So in order for something to be the true negation of the negation, you know, this absolute negativity, which is wholly within itself, it would have to mediate itself with itself. Something would have to mediate something. You see, is, you know, he's already implying this this reflection. You know, just like everything else, the moment you have a determinacy, you gotta have this reflection. And every time you have reflection, what do you have? I mean, even becoming, cease to be in community. What was it that we figured out? They're literally just reflections of each other. They're the same kind of thing, if not the same thing. And here he mentions mediation with itself is posited in the something insofar as the latter is determined as a simple identity. This is, you know, bringing something up which should make sense to us. You know, positing an identity here doesn't mean something that's much more different than what we normally would mean. But these are actually terms that are from the logic of essence. So we can't quite appeal to those things yet in order to speak of the absolute negativity of something. So something else must go on before we can fully articulate what's happening, how this self-identity works. Continuing, this mediation with itself, which something is in itself, when taken only as a negation of negation, has no concrete determinations for its sides. Thus it collapses into the simple unity which is being. Something is, and is therefore also inexistent. Further, it is in itself also becoming, but a becoming that no longer has only being and nothing for its moments. One of these moments, being, is now existence, and further inexistent. The other moment is equally inexistent, but determined as the negative of something, an other. As becoming, something is a transition, the moments of which are themselves something, and for that reason it is an alteration, a becoming that has already become concrete. At first, however, something alters only in its concept. It is not yet posited in this way as mediated and mediating, but at first only as maintaining itself simply in its reference to itself, and its negative is posited as equally qualitative as only an other in general. So when he says this mediation with itself, which something is in itself, when taken only as a negation of negation, has no concrete determinations for its sides. Thus it collapses into the simple unity which is being. So something doesn't mean very much at all at this point. When Hegel says in itself, one way you could translate that into regular understanding, it's simply it is not yet explicitly what it should be or what it will be. You know, it's only in potential, it's not yet fully developed. So this mediation with itself, which something is in itself, you know, it implicitly, potentially must be this mediation already, but it's not yet explicit for us. When taken only as a negation of negation, has no concrete determinations for its sides, thus it collapses into the simple unity which is being. So something is just yet another simple affirmation of existence. It's just another determinacy. Something is, and is therefore also an existent. Further, it is in itself also becoming, but a becoming that no longer has only being and nothing for its moments. And I think we could take that in various ways, and I think all the ways are true. It's a becoming both as, obviously, it has determinacy. You know, determinacy itself already is the very splitting which becoming causes, you know, into its stable elements. It's the very differentiation. The fact that it has difference means it already has becoming. But it's also the fact that becoming itself shall be a term which functions for us just like becoming functions for itself. That all it is a transitionary term. That all it is a term which is going to lead us into something else, which is the real stability of the thing. Something on its own is simply this vanishing term which doesn't actually say much of anything at all for itself. So as a simple unity of being, continuing, one of these moments, being, is now existence and further inexistent. The other moment is equally inexistent, but determined as the negative of something and other. As becoming, something is a transition, the moments of which are themselves something, and for that reason it is an alteration, a becoming that has already become concrete. At first, however, something alters only in its concept. It is not yet posited in this way as mediated and mediating, but at first only as maintaining itself simply in its reference to itself, and its negative is posited as equally qualitative as only an other in general. So, like I said before, the fact that something is made as a determinacy and therefore, you know, implies the other, and yet we know that in every time we have this reflection, the reflection is also a reflection that is identical. The same thing is other to itself. So something is other to something. It's an opposition to itself, and the other is, from the standpoint of the other of the other. And much of what's going to come right now is going to be really developed from the side of the other, because it's the only term that does for us this linguistic trick of fully explicitly making clear that this is a self-development, a self-relation, a self-reflection of determinacy itself. All right, is that more or less clear?
Yes, but I just don't want to like interrupt you on every little sentence. But I think I got it more or less. I think it's quite interesting compare it to Fichte and how he establishes identity, and because it's pretty much the similar process of negativity, and I don't know. It's just like my understanding of it.
Yeah, I read about like 20 pages of Fichte from the Wissenschaftler. And yeah, something similar is going on, but not quite the same, because Hegel here doesn't want to rely on things like identity, doesn't want to rely on things just it's like, oh well, like if you reflect on it, like you obviously see these things because they're illegitimate. If we just step back and reflect on it and say and suddenly start seeing things, that's just us. We could or we could not have seen those things. Whereas Hegel's real plan here is to go at it from within and fully develop this from within, so that there's no issue with well, you know, one person sees it, the other does not. And then the whole question is like, well, you know, what's the legitimacy of like having these categories that come out of, you know, externally? You know, how do they really connect? You know, do we have any like warrant to actually connect them, etc. So notions of identity and positing and you know, what things seem to obviously be, such as, you know, the diagrams on becoming. If you look at it, you're like, ah, well, obviously. He doesn't want to rely on any of that. He wants to go at this completely from within, only using the resources of like this thinking through and then self-relating back to show that you know, things are going to be linking up eventually.
Can I just go like for 30 seconds through the page?
Yeah.
Just
Alright, let me know when you're ready to move on.
Yeah, just a second. Okay, great. Yeah, I think it will be quite helpful that after we done the reading, we do a little recap too, because
Alright.
I think some of this stuff is it's okay to take in detail, but I lose like the look of the whole as such. So
Yeah.
okay,
So,
finitude then.
Yep, B. Finitude. A. Something and other. At first they are indifferent to one another. An other is also in immediate existence a something. The negation thus falls outside both. Something is in itself in contrast to its being for other, but the determinateness belongs also to its in itself, and B. The determination of this in itself in turn passes over into constitution, and this latter, as identical with determination, constitutes the immanent and at the same time negated being for other, the limit of something which, C, is the immanent determination of the something itself, and the something thus is the finite. In the first division, where existence in general was considered, this existence had, as at first taken up, the determination of inexistent. The moments of its development, quality and something, are therefore of equally affirmative determination. The present division, on the contrary, develops the negative determination which is present in existence, and was there from the start only as negation in general. It was then the first negation, but has now been determined to the point of being in itself, of the something, the point of the negation of the negation. So up to now, from existence to quality to something, we've only worked with the affirmative side. We haven't yet talked about the negative side. We've talked about it being there, but we haven't talked about it explicitly. So, as we ended up, we got to qualitative being, which is being in itself. Determinate being. A. Something and other. And an other. 1. Something and other are, first, both existence, or something. Second, each is equally an other. It is indifferent which is named first, and just for this reason it is named something. In Latin, when they occur in a proposition, both are aliud, or the one the other, alius alium. In the case of an alternating relation, the analogous expression is alter alterum. So, it's recalling the whole distinction and non-distinction of being a nothing. If of two beings we call the one A and the other B, the B is the one which is first determined as other. But A is just as much the other of B. Both are other in the same way. This, quote this, unquote, serves to fix the distinction and the something which is to be taken in the affirmative sense. But this also expresses the fact that the distinction and the privileging of one something is a subjective designation that falls outside the something itself. The whole determinateness falls on the side of this external pointing. Also, the expression this contains no distinctions. Each and every something is just as good a this as any other. By this, we mean to express something completely determinate, overlooking the fact that language as a work of the understanding only expresses the universal, albeit naming it as a single object. But an individual name is something meaningless in the sense that it does not express a universal. It appears as something merely posited, and it does not express a It appears as something merely posited and arbitrary for the same reason that proper names can also be arbitrarily picked, arbitrarily given, as well as arbitrarily altered.
Well, I heard this line in one Heristomati, and in that particular context, it said that this was kind of Hegel's critique of positivism.
I think it is a critique of positivism in that positivism was the idea that propositions in language were the names of things. If you say apple, it's the individual signifier for the apple in front of you, or the apple somewhere, God knows where. That these things only were signifiers for other real things. Obviously, Hegel says, saying something, saying others, saying this, saying apple, it's meaningless. He says, by this we mean to express something completely determinate, overlooking the fact that language, as a work of the understanding, only expresses the universal, albeit naming it as a single object. So, if you take the positivist line that, such a word is just simply a signifier for an actual individual object or a thing, you've messed out on the fact that obviously there's a contradiction right there. You've collapsed the universal into an individual. Can't do that. It doesn't make sense. But an individual name is something meaningless in the sense that it does not express a universal. So simple signifiers, simple names aren't concepts. They're not actually universal. They don't mean anything.
Yeah, in this sense, it kind of tricks us, because we say this, but we can only talk about universals, and we can't really say that something is concrete. I mean, we can, but when you say apple, you don't mean that specific apple. You always mean idea of apple.
I wouldn't say that, because he says...
But yeah, I'm just saying from the line where he says that as a work of the understanding only expresses the universe, all but the naming it as a single object.
Yeah. So it's not that we don't mean the singular individual thing when we really mean the universal. No, it's we mean the individual thing, but we don't actually say the individual thing. That's the difference. So what we mean and what we say does not align. So here he's opening up also the critique towards what he hasn't intended us to be doing, but we, if we are the average thinker, this is what we've been doing ourselves, which is we think that in being a nothing, we were actually referring to two things merely named and intended as two different things. What he's revealing here is obviously the point that I made earlier, that in fact we're not referring to different things at all. We've actually been talking about just this process of a self-determination from, you know, this pure abstraction we originally had all the way to here. You know, that in being a nothing, we weren't actually talking about such a thing like an object of being a nothing here, this object named being.
Yeah, makes sense.
God dang doggo barking. It's alright, continuing. Otherness. Yeah?
No, it's okay. I thought you
Alright.
forgot where we were.
Now, otherness thus appears as a determination alien to the existence thus pointed at, or the other existence as outside this one existence, partly because the one existence is determined as other only by being compared by a third, and partly because it is so determined only on account of the other which is outside it, but is not an other for itself. But at the same time, it has been remarked, even for ordinary thinking, every existence equally determines itself as an other existence, so that there is no existence that determines itself as an other existence. So that there is no existence that remains determined simply as an existence, none which is not outside an existence and therefore is not itself an other. So he says, if we say something is something, and then we say, but it's the other of the other, we're talking about as if the other existence, the otherness is outside it, that it is the other of the other only in relation to the other, or the other existence as outside this one existence, partly because the one existence is determined as other only by being compared by a third. That is, the something is the other of the other, which is also a something, only because we're the third factor here, are the ones who say it is. You know, in this way, we think that this otherness is actually just an external thing, that it's not really part of something, that something is simply something. Ivan says this is kind of exactly as Fichte determines how we get to know the object outside ourselves. They are kind of part of us. Yeah, that seems how it does. He does determine it, at least with the parts I read on the I equals I. You know, how the self posits itself. You know, the other is really an other, but it also originates within ourselves. It is both ourselves and not ourselves. So this is just him clarifying even more, and it's a very subtle clarification. God knows I actually missed it when I first read it. That, you know, if we've been making this mistake of just thinking about it as two separate things, referring, you know, externally by our picking out of it, that's not what he's doing. So continuing, both are determined as something as well as other. Thus they are the same, and there is yet no distinction present in them. So, you know, if we want to just get rid of this reflection in which we thought, oh, something here, others there, let's just collapse it into one, because that's really all it ends up being. The something is an other. We don't have to think it in the same way that we don't have to think being an other as respective different moments. They are literally just the same thing. But this sameness of determinations, too, falls only within external reflection, in the comparison of the two. But the other, as posited at first, though an other with reference to something, is other also for itself apart from the something. Third, the other is therefore to be taken in isolation, with reference to itself, has to be taken abstractly as the other. And I don't know how to say that in Greek. The something in Greek, God knows, of Plato.
Yeah, I don't know.
Who opposes it to the one as a moment of totality, and in this way ascribes to the other a nature of its own. Thus, the other, taken solely as such, is not the other of something, but is the other within, that is, the other of itself. You notice why this is going to be developed from the side of the other, not from something. Because only the other can speak exactly what we need to say. Only the other expresses itself as other both to itself and as itself. If we were to use the word nothing, or the word something for this, it just wouldn't have this self-reflexive appearance, which is the appearance we need for the content that we're actually going to develop. If we somehow it just doesn't strike you as strongly as it needs to if you say that the something is the other of something, that the something is the other of itself. Saying the other is the other of itself far more strongly reveals this self-reflexive oneness and self-otheringness which Hegel wants us to get out of this movement of determinacy. Alright, continuing. Such an other, which is the other by its own determination, is physical nature. Nature is the other of spirit. This, its determination, is at first a mere relativity expressing not a quality of nature itself, but only a reference external to it. But since spirit is the true something, and hence nature is what it is within only in contrast to spirit, taken for itself, the quality of nature is just this, to be the other within, that which exists outside itself, in the determinations of space, time, and matter. That's a tongue twister and a mind twister. Partly because it alludes to something that just won't fully make sense to us until the end of the logic. And even then, there's quite a bit of a non-agreement on what the hell it means. Even though I think there are some accounts that definitely make sense of it. But anyways, when he says such an other which is the other by its own determination, determination just means an affirmative, self-affirmative quality, which includes its otherness. Is physical nature. Nature is the other of spirit. This, its determination, is at first a mere relativity, expressing not a quality of nature itself, but only a reference external to it. So the external othering of nature from spirit is, well, nature is the other of spirit. You know, you, the subject, say that of nature. But what does nature say of itself as the other of spirit? Therefore, you know, he says, but since spirit is the true something, and hence nature is what it is within only in contrast to spirit, taken for itself, the quality of nature is just this, to be the other within, that which exists outside of itself, in the determinations of space, time, and matter. So, reading this literally, one has to understand that nature is spirit outside itself. Spirit here is using an advanced determination, which we have no warrant even at the end of the logic to make, but the structure fits, you know, the intention fits. He's really saying exactly what he will say at the end of the logic, which is nature is the idea outside itself. And obviously, by making this distinction of outsidedness, just as how here in something and other, the distinction exists, you know, which exists outside itself. Spirit, the same as the philosophy of history. Yes and no, in that, you know, spirit, specifically in the philosophy of history, is being spirit within the its particular meaning of freedom, self-determination. Spirit here, in this context, is spirit particularly in the sense of the idea, the logic, as opposed to nature, because at the end of the science of logic, the movement to nature is going to be the determination of the idea reflecting upon the idea. How can the idea be outside itself? Nature. Nature is the self-externality, the idea outside the idea. And you can see this is playing on the theme he wants to get us right here. That these movements are going to be movements of self-reflexive negation. The other of the other is obviously the negation of the other within itself. You know, the other others itself. It's its own movement, just as being nothing's itself, becoming becomes itself. This self-reflexive movement is absolutely crucial in everything. Alright, so continuing, the other which is such for itself is the other within it, hence the other of itself, and so the other of the other. Therefore, the absolutely unequal in itself, that which negates itself, alters itself. But it equally remains identical with itself, for that into which it alters is the other, and this other has no additional determination. But that which alters itself is not determined in any other way than in this, to be an other. In going over to this other, it only unites with itself. It is thus posited as reflected into itself with sublation of the otherness, a self-identical something from which the otherness, which is at the same time a moment of it, is therefore distinct, itself not appertaining to it as something. So the other which is such for itself as the other within it, hence the other of itself, and so the other of the other. Notice that something is existent, you know, and the other, therefore, which is a something, is also existent. It's a determinacy. What was qualitative being? Determinateness. It's the determinate being of determinate being. Where is this determinate being of determinate being? Well, it is obviously within determinate being. You see how it is the other of itself? You know, within itself, it is other to itself. It distinguishes itself from itself. You know, the same thing for being. You know, the being of being is the otherness of being in relation to itself. No, this would be the absolute negativity, because it's negativity applying to itself. It's a self-reflexive negativity. Abstract negativity was saying there's an other here and an other there, and I'm the one who says that they are other. You know, it's an external negativity. It's just a yeah. So you see how this reapplies right back to where we came from. You know, everything that we've done up to now comes into light within this logic of the other of the other. You know, this self-othering other. But you know, because the other of the other is the other of itself, it is nonetheless itself. You know, it equally remains identical with itself, for that into which it alters is the other. So the other becomes the other of itself, but what has it become? Nothing but itself. You know, it's just how being became nothing, but nothing was immediately being again. In being the other, it is right back to being itself. And this other has no additional determination. But that which alters itself is not determined in any other way than in this, to be an other. In going over to this other, it only unites with itself. See, you know, in negating itself, it is only uniting with itself. You know, it's only in unity with itself, immediate self-unity. You know, where there is, so where we thought there was an absolute distinction between being and nothing, we find only an absolute self-unity. It is thus posited as reflected into itself with sublation of the otherness. Therefore, how does the other of the other become the other of itself? Where does it become the other of itself? Well, within itself. You know, that's why it's sublated. You know, the other is the other of itself. The other of itself is within itself. It's not something externally outside and, you know, completely disconnected from it. A self-identical something from which the otherness, which is at the same time a moment of it, is therefore distinct, itself not appertaining to it as something. And here the moment of something is the moment in which we're going to focus on just one aspect of the othering, you know, the absolute other, and the something is just one moment, the moment in which we just want to point out to one of the others and say, okay, this is something, you know, as opposed to that other something. So, you know, a self-identical something from which the otherness, which is at the same time a moment of it, is therefore distinct, itself not appertaining to it as something. And do you want to leave it there, you know, and start on with part number 2 for next time?
Number 2. Yeah, I'm just looking how much it has till the end.
Okay, 2 isn't that long.
Yeah, I think we should go till the end, but since today there's only me and you, so it will be. But yeah, I think we should go till the end because I'm just like curious.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's just you or me. So long as somebody's learning, I'm here. The rest can definitely listen, and questions for next time. So 2. The something preserves itself in its non-being, It is essentially one with it and essentially not one with it. It therefore stands in reference to an otherness without being just this otherness. The otherness is at once contained in it and yet separated from it. It is being for other. You know, here we finally have the tool to sort of say something about how it is that thought and thinking are one and the same thing, and yet a distinct thing. You know, that being and its being are one and the same thing, but also a distinct thing. In that, you know, if they were just the same thing, just a pure oneness, the distinction would just collapse and we would have said nothing at all. If they were an absolute distinctness, we'd have a problem of like, well, how did we get there? So we have this seeming paradox of, well, it must be one with it, but not one with it. Existence as such is an immediate, bare of references, or it is in the determination of being. However, as including non-being within itself, existence is determinate being, being negated within itself, and then in the first instance an other, but since in being negated it preserves itself at the same time, it is only being for other. So, you know, it's just how, what I said earlier, that in order for being to be, it has to hold itself against itself, to be this unity within itself. Because if it didn't do so, it would simply collapse into an absolute nothingness. Nothingness in the sense of just like the Parmenidean nothingness. It cannot be. In order for being to be, it must be against itself, negate itself, other itself. It must first be being for other. All right, clear?
Yep. This is quite interesting. We came full circle from first chapter.
Yeah. It's the Hegel is so difficult because this is how much we've built up in just 2 chapters. There's like
it's
650 pages more of this. Can you believe? Can you believe how much you can say by the end of anything?
Yeah, it's really full of content. I'm just I'm a little bit overwhelmed, but yeah. I think I'll do rereading.
Yeah, it always helps to do a rereading. I used to reread these a lot the first time I read them. I mean, I still do a rereading, but usually I do my notes and I try to think about things and I think about my thinking. Continuing. It preserves itself in its non-being and is being. Not, however, being in general, but being with reference to itself in contrast to its reference to the other, as self-equality in contrast to its inequality. Such a being is being in itself. So, you know, that's the flip side of being for other. You know, if being for other is the negative side, obviously in determinacy, we must have the flip side. If there is an affirmation, there must be a negation. But what is the negation of the negation of being for other? Well, the negation of being for other is being in itself. Being for other and being in itself constitute the 2 moments of something. There are here 2 pairs of determination. 1, something and other. 2, being for other and being in itself. The former contain the non-connectedness of their determinateness. Something and other fall apart. But their truth is their connection. being for other and being in itself are therefore the same determinations posited as moments of one and the same unity, as determinations which are connections and which, in their unity, remain in the unity of existence. Each thus itself contains within it, at the same time, also the moment diverse from it. So at first it seems, obviously, that being for other and being in itself are two distinct things. That something is being for in itself, it is just that, the affirmation of being, and that something is being for other is just an externality of affirmative being. You know, without affirmative being, you don't have being for other. But if you have a being affirmative being, why in the world would you need to be for other? You are already for yourself. You are being in itself, right? The problem is that being in itself is not being for itself yet. And as you can see, they imply each other already, you know. In order to have being for other, you gotta have being in itself. But in order to have being in itself, we've already discovered you can't just have being, you must have the being of being. You must have the other of the other in order to have the other at all. Being and nothing in their unity, which is existence, are no longer being and nothing. These they are only outside their unity. So in the restless unity in becoming, they are coming to be and ceasing to be. In the something, being is being in itself. Now, as self-reference, self-equality, being no longer immediately, but is self-reference only as the non-being of otherness, as existence reflected into itself. The same goes for non-being. As the moment of something in this unity of being and non-being, it is not non-existence in general, but is the other, and more determinately, according as being is at the same time distinguished from it. It is reference to its non-existence, being for other. So here's him connecting us back to, you know, what people often say, that, you know, the higher, you know, the lifting up of the lower concepts, except it's not quite lifting up, but yeah, the image works well enough, even though I think it's misleading. Because we still have being and nothing in their indeterminacy, you know. The original identity of being is nothing, this abstract, indeterminate identity, it's still there. But now, in something, we have that first indeterminate identity brought up to a higher form of itself. And therefore, you know, it is itself and not itself. So, in the something, being is being in itself. Now as self-reference, self-equality, being is no longer immediately, but as self-reference only as the non-being of otherness, as existence reflected into itself. The same goes for non-being. As the moment of something in this unity of being and non-being, it is not non-existence in general, but is the other. Non-existence would have been, you know, the original idea of nothing, as, you know, the absolute absence of being, you know, this abstract negation. But is the other, and more determinedly, according as being is at the same time distinguished from it, it is reference to its non-existence, being for other. So here I think specifically from the side of something, if being is being in itself, then the non-being is the non-being of the other. So the non-being is the other, but being is the non-being of the non-being. You know, being in itself is the non-being of being for other. So, that's why he says, according as being is at the same time distinguished from it, it is reference to its non-existence, being for other. So being in itself is also reference to being for other, the non-existence. Hence, being in itself is, first, negative reference to non-existence. It has otherness outside it and is opposed to it. Insofar as something is in itself, it is withdrawn from being other and being for other. But second, it has non-being also right in it, for it is itself the non-being of being for other. But being for other is, first, the negation of the simple reference of being to itself, which, in the first place, is supposed to be existence and something. Insofar as something is in an other or for an other, it lacks a being of its own. But second, it is not non-existence as pure nothing. It is non-existence that points to being in itself, as its own reflected, as its being reflected into itself, just as conversely the being in itself points to being for other. So, I mean, this small little section was a fine example of how it's starting to get seemingly viciously circular. And it's where it's helpful for you to start like having these making diagrams in which you start seeing diagramming the relations and the reflections, because otherwise it's a bit difficult keeping track of the whole the nothings of the nothings, the beings of beings, the being of the other of the being, how being itself is a non-being of non-being.
Yeah, it's but I'm doing notes on my computer, sadly, so maybe only if I turned on Paint or something like that.
Yeah, I'm working on some diagrams myself, just kind of showcase this. But I mean, it's kind of hard because it really is a linguistic thing. If you try to show it in language, there's certain things about it which unfortunately remain untrue about it. For example, like if you really try to show the being and nothing from the one perspective of their unity, you can't do it. The way pictures work immediately set this up in this oppositional duality of two things, which it really isn't. As Hegel keeps trying to make us acknowledge that the other of the other isn't two things. The other of the other is actually one thing, which is other to itself within itself. And it's not this external otherness. But when you make a picture, an image or a diagram, it seems impossible to actually show this. But they are helpful.
Okay, so we have I think it's 3 pages more, but I'm not really sure. I'm real like this whole part so overwhelmed me, but yeah. Should we go on, or what do you think?
We can go on. Either way, we'll do a recap the next time, a pretty thorough recap, because I think it should definitely help.
Yeah, it's as I said, it's pretty hard because when you look at the little details, it's quite hard to get a bigger picture, and also coming back to your two diagrams and everything, that also helps in that same sense.
All right, so 3. Both moments are determinations of one and the same, namely of something. Something is in itself insofar as it has returned from this being for other back to itself. But something has also a determination or circumstance, whether in itself, here the accent is on the in, or in it. So, insofar as the circumstance is in it externally, it is a being for other. So that one's a bit tricky, but both moments are determinations, both moments being being in itself and being for other, of one and the same, namely of something. Something is in itself insofar it has returned from the being for other back to itself. But something has also a determination or circumstance, whether in itself, here the accent is on the in, or in it. Insofar as this circumstance is in it externally, it is a being for other. So something has both being in itself and being for other. The question here is of a nuance. He says something has also a determination or circumstance, whether in itself or in it. And the in is important. Insofar as the circumstance is in it externally, it is a being for other. So if the being for other, the otherness of something, is not within it, then it can't actually have this being in itself that it pretends to have. It only really has this being for other. It only is what it is because of its opposition to an other. Make sense?
Hello.
3 in the morning. By God. that is not a time to be thinking about Hegel.
Yeah, and I did like for 3 hours. I was practicing first order logic and so on.
Oh God.
But yeah.
I think then we should leave it there, because it'll rest your brain and you'll be able to comprehend better.
I'm just like realizing now that it's it's quite hard for me. I'm quite tired.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, we'll leave it right there at part 3. It's actually perfect because the stuff that comes right after is going to need a fresh understanding of this part 3. But
Okay,
yeah,
great. Thanks, man.
Yeah, no problem. See you next week. Hopefully on Saturday, more people come. I'll do a quick recap with Josh, and I'll post it right after.
Alright, thanks.
Alright, Josh, so we did... do you want a full recap, like summary of like everything we went through, or just like the stuff that we didn't go through last time?
I'm not sure. Whichever you'd prefer to do.
Alright, so one of the things I talked about early on was pointing out something that I figured out, and it's like now it's just clear as day, because Hegel definitely harps on it right after in Something and Other. That the interpretation I had was definitely a reflective externality. You know, when you say like something, when you know, the diagrams, if you've seen them, of becoming, of being and nothing. You know, we have like being here on one side and, you know, nothing the next, and we have like becoming as a circle of them both.
Yeah.
You know, as if like you have ceasing to be here and you have coming to be there, and then we say, you know, but ceasing to be, being is coming to be, and nothing, you're both the same, and so you have two things, being and nothing, but they're identical. That's not what Hegel intends us to think, but it's what we naturally think. It's the easiest way we can get at it, because the real thing is a tripper. The real thing is that right at the beginning, the whole trick is out in the open, but even if Hegel told you, like, it would be so difficult to grasp for a complete newbie. Because when Hegel says being is nothing, you know, we find that out by thinking being. That really says it all. Like, that really says it all. You don't even need the dialectic, because there is no need for it. Being is nothing. And let me pull up my goddamn thing where I wrote out what it was, why that is. So remember when at the beginning, like in chapter 1, I think it's like somewhere in section 3, Hegel says like in one sentence something about how the activity of nothing and nothing itself like make no difference. You know, the result is the same no matter what.
Yeah.
And how I said that interests me because I keep trying to make sense of that.
Does that have to do with, correct me if I'm wrong. So I know that being is becoming because being is only being as it's being thought.
Yes.
And nothing is the lack of movement. And becoming is movement, of course.
That's where we're both wrong, if we thought about that way. And here's the realization. Let me pull this up. Okay, go to the Science of Logic, the text chat right there.
Yeah.
Scroll up. I posted 3 diagrams, which explain what I'm going to say.
Yep, I see them.
Okay, the first diagram is the picture we get if we thought that we could look at this in the sense of, like, you know, ceasing to be as being and nothing, and coming to be as nothing, or, you know, 2 simultaneous moments of becoming, like, side by side, right? You know, this unity of being nothing is a side by sideness.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a bad visualization. Okay, sorry, kids are yelling. Alright, so that side-by-sideness, that's wrong. It's One, it says too much, because that literally puts us as the point of something another. Visually, if we saw that, we would already just like think about something another in the sense of its structures. Hegel doesn't want us to just do that, because that's just jumping too far. But, and you could also simplify it, so there's the second diagram right there. So the large circle denotes the overarching universal unity of becoming, subsuming its moments, It is ceasing to be and coming to be as being a nothing. So that circle is a bit misleading. Part of it is, it's already saying too much. For it is in fact not there as something other to its moments, but rather is the unity of its moments of being a nothing. So it's not, this actually reveals something interesting about all Hegelian universals. All Hegelian universals aren't this overarching existent thing over and above their parts. They are literally just the acknowledgement of the unity of their parts.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So all Hegelian universals have this peculiar characteristics. The universal as such only exists as its particular individual forms in thought and as empirical things. So just as becoming immediately splits into its moments, its particular movements, so too does every other concept. No universal actually ever appears as universal. In order to actually appear as universal, it first has to appear as actual individuals. So that's one of the issues, that it's kind of hard for me not to do that, because I want to show, well, it's the unity, but it's misleading. Alright, so the second diagram, well, we'll continue on that diagram. Something must be first noticed. Being nothing's original identity in difference appears in becoming just as it did in their abstract identity. However, they are not completely indeterminate as in the beginning. In becoming, being and nothing are one and the same for the same reason of content. They share the exact same content under an intended different term. Their content now, however, is not indeterminate. Rather, it is their becoming. Being and nothing as such remain to us a partial mystery. However, we know one thing about them for sure. They become each other. Unfortunately, becoming has only revealed their unseparateness, but not their distinction as being nothing in themselves. We must continue to intend their difference without a clear conceptual structure that settles this difference. This intention is why being nothing must appear to us as still merely a subjectively determined perspective of an intended opposition of affirmation and negation. Being is that which affirms, nothing is that which negates. But in becoming structure, we find both moments inseparable, in that each moment already carries its opposition within itself and can never be separated no matter what we do. This intended difference shall eventually be explained and will not negate this identity and difference of being and nothing, but this explanation is far off in the logic of essence. Okay, so you see, like, if we still try to think of being and nothing, as this, normally, as this distinction, it becomes a matter of perspective of which is being, which is nothing. Even though we kind of, if we look at it as a whole, we say, okay, well, they're both being nothing, right?
Yeah.
So as we can see, since being is ceasing to be, and thus it is its vanishedness as nothing, yet nothing is its vanishedness into being. Because time has no place in logic, things are best considered as already having passed and played out. Thus being has always already vanished into its opposite and back again. Regardless of where we stand in becoming, everything looks the same. Whether we look at becoming as the big circle and its being nothing as frozen, as ceasing and coming to be, or whether we look at it being nothing as totalities of becoming in themselves, which is what the first diagram shows, we see the exact same thing, the immediate unity of being and nothing, which itself is a unity. From the perspective of the frozen becoming, which is the unity of being and nothing as ceasing coming to be, we see the immediate unity of both in the same moment, as we already know. However, being and nothing have always already been their opposite just as much as they are themselves. To call its moments being or nothing is merely an arbitrary selection of giving primacy of one moment over the other. Yet there is no such primacy, for all being is just as much nothing and of no greater meaning than the intent of affirmation for itself and negation against another. From the perspective of the moments as a whole, which naturally follows from the consideration of their truth as both, we see each as a totality of becoming in themselves. Being is nothing insofar as it is the ceasing to be of the being immediately beside it. Nothing is being insofar as that comes to be as the nothing immediately beside it ceases to be. Nothing here holds no secret meaning. It is a literal nothing of non-being. And it is just that. Being is nothing insofar as it is the non-being of the being beside it. Nothing is intelligible as a negation of another. Alright, so that's the external reflection point. Makes sense, right? That's the one I've explained before.
Yeah.
So if we look at the total relation of being and nothing, we cannot help but be forced to accept that they are indeed one and the same, yet necessarily different. We can only attend to one moment as a standpoint necessary for connection. Alright, my computer's charged up a bit. Let me go outside. Dang kid. Okay, so we can only attend to one moment as a standpoint necessary to cognition. Thus, we must think the moment of being and nothing in temporal succession, for we can only inhabit one moment at a time. Nonetheless, in recollection we can and must recognize the truth that logically both moments are simultaneous in relation to each other and within themselves. Being is nothing not just in relation to another, but in relation to itself. You know, this is the trick. Let us not forget. Being vanished into nothing completely of its own account when it was not even compared to anything. Becoming only is the name of the simultaneous fall of being and nothing into each other. The diagram need not have gone any further than the first level of the distinction, which is the second diagram. In which, I get rid of this advanced, the both being as totalities of becoming. Being is being and nothing. It is ceasing and coming to be. It is becoming. It is existence. This diagram is misleading, the second one, but in truth all diagrams of this movement must be misleading. Up to now I have exposed being and nothing as singular moments, but this is a reflection to aid us in finally grasping the speculative truth. One must not take being and nothing as separate, such as the circles seem to show, but rather as superimposed, which is what the third diagram shows. Nothing and being are not just like separate substances which have two perspectives, or rather they are really one and the same thing. Nothing is. Being is a negativity. It comes to be as a negation of indeterminacy. What we know not what of being itself, an abstraction from absolute abstraction. In order for being to be, it must hold itself firm against itself. For as the indeterminate absolute being, it's just devoid of everything including itself. In its abstract absoluteness, being is in fact unspeakable, inexperientiable, unintuitable, unthinkable, it is indeed the very thing we think we mean by nothing, that which is not and cannot be. As Parmenides claimed, being is, nothing is not. As we see, being is not. Thus, it is nothing. And the way this relates to determinate being is, I mean, it's kind of a joke, but it's literal. What is determinate being? It's the being of being. And since being is nothing, what is the being of being? Nothing. But since nothing is a negation, and negations require affirmations, nothing is. And what is the implicit thing that happens right there in the fact that it happened? Negativity.
This is so fucking crazy.
It is, isn't it? The one-sided movement is all you actually need to get right there. You didn't need this whole reflection of thinking of the two at the same time or beside each other. You actually needed just one thing, the being of nothing. Because that's literally what being is. Being really is nothing. The being of being is nothing. But what was nothing? Well, nothing is negativity. So being is in virtue of nothing, but nothing is nothing but the being of being. And I mean, and you could literally understand it in both ways because it makes sense exactly in both ways. Either you have absolute being, and in order to be, if it was absolute being, then it literally could not be speakable. It could not be thinkable. Because you would have to submerge, you would have to literally dissolve yourself within the absolute. And therefore there could be no difference. And as such, there would be nothing. It couldn't even be.
Yeah.
So the being of being requires this self-negation of being. But likewise, if nothing was absolute, it would have to nothing itself. And the nothing of nothing, the negativity of negativity, the negation of negation, is affirmation. The nothingness of nothingness is being. And it's the same thing, like the becoming of becoming is being. It's pretty trippy, man. Pretty trippy. And I figured that out yesterday. Like it finally struck me when I forget how it is that I even came up with it. But once it struck me, I'm like, that's it. That's exactly the issue I was having before. Like, I knew that there was this. The one thing that I was understanding it as was a reflection. It wasn't a genuine thing. It had to be a self-reflexive thing. But it only struck me until yesterday that how that could be. And that self-reflexiveness is pure, what Hegel will call pure absolute negativity. That even in any negation, like there will be an affirmation, whether it's a negation of all detail or whether it's a negation of all everything. The moment you posit it, it's contradictory. The moment negativity starts negating, it's got to negate it. Even if there's nothing to negate, well, it's going to negate itself. I mean, it also gives a detail to how thought is thinking. So when we begin with existence, in which Hegel says, determinacy is being with a non-being, it's literally just a restatement of the very beginning. Being is nothing. Being is its own self-negation into determinacy. You go right from indeterminacy, but in beginning indeterminacy, in beginning with nothing, in beginning with just a pure abstraction, you're going to get detailed no matter what. Its very being will do it for you. So in existence, we start with determinacy is being with non-being. Well, that's it. That is both the beginning. Being is nothing. That is becoming. Being becomes nothing. It's also the explanation of how the activity and the result are intrinsically tied. Thought and thinking are intrinsically tied. They aren't the same thing, but they are also inherently the same thing.
That's always, that's pretty much, it sums up what I found so weird about this dialectic. A lot of it is these things are the same, and yet they aren't at the same time. Like with being and nothing, of course, and being and becoming, so on.
Yeah. Like if you're presented with the actual speculative movement, it's so strange that from the get-go you can't get it. You really have to figure it out yourself, because only after you've thought about it in the reflective ways, does it seem you've become accustomed enough to accepting this paradox as being a non-paradox, in which it makes sense even while it seems nonsense, that you probably are comfortable enough that you would probably not just immediately go, wait, that's bullshit, when you're presented with the real operation of it. Because literally what determinacy is, what is it? It's self-negation. Being is being, determinacy is being with non-being taken up into itself. How could it have non-being taken up into itself? By negating itself and splitting itself. So the truth of determinacy is self-negativity, self-negation. And this is how we start building up everything. It actually all comes right from within the same thing. And it doesn't come externally, literally being is being. And the very fact that it is being already has been its own self-negation. So the being of being is determinate being. Pretty neat. Let's see. The stuff on something is obviously something is the term which arises when we unite. Well, actually, like step back and consider a determinate being in its determinacy, which is, you know, the determinate. Determinateness was quality. So one of the things to notice there is that that determinateness is not outside determinate being. It's not outside existence. The existent existence is existent within itself. So it's not anything external. So the actual like real category that we've arrived at when we have a qualitative being is being in itself. But then we call that whole ensemble of being in itself, quality and determinate being, as something. That's on page 89, but I'm just going over it real quickly. Page 89, second paragraph at the beginning. He says something is the first negation of negation. As simple existence, self-reference, existence, life, thought, and so forth essentially take on the determination of an existent being, a living thing, a thinking mind, I, and so forth. And this is him basically just pointing back to what I'm saying, in which like being is already its own negation. You know, being literally is nothing, and that being is the self-operation of itself on itself as a negation. Like being, like the act of being is the process of negation, of the process of determinacy, which is the moving process of life. So he says it's not just existence, life, thought, and so forth. It actually is an existent being, that is the being, the actual activity of being, a living thing. You know, it's not just life in the abstract, defined, and a thinking mind. It's not just a thought. It's the thinking of a thought. So it's this unity. It's, you know, it's, you see how it builds up? Like, once you understand, like, that's where the being of nothing, you know, nothing is, being is nothing. Being is negativity, you know, being is actually this being is becoming. So life is a living thing, existence is an existing being, existent being. A thought is a thinking. You know, its activity is literally what it is. Pretty neat, right?
Yeah.
Also, bottom of that paragraph, he says that nothing is, that something is the first negation of negation. He says, if you understand something as abstract as just like this pure affirmation, as something, the negative is only the beginning of the subject. Its in itselfness is still quite indeterminate. It determines itself further on, at first as existent for itself, and so on until it finally obtains in the concept the intensity of the subject. So if we think about this truly, it's going to actually be this negative that fully ends up generating itself into like the concept of the subject. Like, literally the concept of what we are doing. He says, at the base of all these determinations there lies the negative unity with itself. And what's that referring to? Well, the being of being. What is that? It's the negative unity of being and being, the unity with itself. How is that the case? Well, because being was nothing. In its nothingness is its own being. It's negation, self-negation. In all this, however, care must be taken to distinguish the first negation, negation as negation in general, from the second negation, the negation of negation, which is concrete, absolute negativity, just as the first is, on the contrary, and only an abstract negativity. So the first negation is just like the negation that you're going to get, that which we had, between being and nothing, in which we thought being is being in that it is not nothing, and nothing is nothing in that it is not being, or being is this being in virtue of not being that other being, and that other being is not being in virtue of this other being. That their being is there from an external abstraction. You know, we're not even mentioning their positive being. So we're only saying that they are because of an abstract negativity outside of them, you know, by virtue of negating an outsiderness. But the absolute negativity will be the full in itselfness and for itselfness of something. And literally, absolute negativity, how do you get it? It's the negation of negation. The being of being. The becoming of becoming. It's the thing which is the other itself within itself. So after that, he just kind of goes over and just the forms of the something and other, and like how weird this is, and like how there's just certain ways in which we must understand this, and he really, I think, goes into detail of why this idea that is appealing for the first diagram on becoming. How, you know, if you freeze it there, it seems like it, but that's not what he's really saying. You know, what he's ultimately talking about is this unity, this real unity in which being and nothing really are one and the same thing. And they're also not one and the same thing. And I mean, I can't say I fully understand it myself yet, in which I fully like have grasped this strange unity and distinction between being and the being of being, as this, you know, between thought and thinking. I see that there is obviously a deep connection between them, but it's also very, very hard for me to grasp just like exactly how that distinction is, other than through the fact that being is its own self-negativity. But of course, in order to have this self-negativity, it would already have to be. So there's a dual tension that already exists between being and what it is. Or rather, being and what it does. But yeah, you can listen to the talk right after. I'll finish it up right here, and I'll upload it. We can talk in the meantime.
Yeah.